It is a great honor and a privilege to introduce George Hans Loewenstein. We're here in your beautiful apartment in Hanover, in Yerushalayim. And George, you are a survivor from the Philippines.
That's correct.
During the Shoah. But originally you were born in Germany.
Yes, I was born in Berlin.
In what year?
In 1934. And my father and grandfather all are from Berlin, so we go back several generations. My mother was born in Oberschlesien, which was at that time German and now is Polish. I know that my dad and some of the other members of my family all served in the German army during the First World War. And that was one of the feelings they had is, you know, how could suddenly Hitler turn on them when they had fought for Germany in the army. And my dad was the recipient of an Iron Cross that he initially was proud of, but at the end, of course, it had no meaning at all anymore. They were, my grandfather and my father were both arrested during Kristallnacht, but were released the next day. But that was the impetus to say that, well, we have to leave Germany. And of course, that was in 1938, Kristallnacht, in November. And we finally got out in August of 1939.
Okay. What are your first memories that you recall?
Well, they're kind of spotty because I remember that my mother had to transfer me from the kindergarten that I was going to a Jewish kindergarten. So I remember, going there, and like any, 5-year-old or 4-year-old, it was very frightening to me and a new experience. I have a picture in my mind of German police with their helmets, which kind of had spikes up on top of their helmet. And lastly, I have a recollection of the Hitler Youth marching down the street, and I was at that age kind of jealous of the fact that they were singing and having uniforms and so forth, which, interestingly enough, gave me the impetus to, got to the United States, and I was 12 years old, to join the Boy Scouts, so I too would have a uniform to wear.
Was your family traditional? Were they Orthodox?
No, they were not. They were, yes, traditional, if that's what you want to call it. I think they're liberal. We got to the United States after the war, and the congregation that we joined was a German Jewish congregation, which the rabbi was German and the cantor were German and the sermons were German. But it was so liberal that, number one, they had a choir and an organ, and there was a mixed choir of men and women, and some were not even Jewish. It was a professional choir. And Friday nights, the shamans would stand at the door with a basket for you to put donations in, you see. So, but, I mean, that's how liberal that congregation was.
But in Germany itself, did they belong to a congregation?
Yeah, they did. I don't remember attending services with them because I was only 5 years old. But and my father was the kind, he would attend on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and that's the extent of it. My maternal grandfather was a kosher butcher, and of course he had a lot more feelings for religion, and while we were in the Philippines during the war, he used to take me to services with him every Shabbat, so anyway.
And George, do you have any recollections of your home in Berlin?
Yeah, I envision a long corridor, like a railroad flat type of thing, where the doors on one side and the rooms open up into a hallway, common hallway. And for my birthday, I got a tricycle, and I recall myself riding up and down the hallway in the tricycle. So they're very selective memories. There's no cohesiveness, to these memories. August 14th is when I was born, and we finally got out of Germany, like it's September 1st, or just before September 1st, when Germany invaded Poland and the start of the World War. So we just made it out on time.
And what type of profession or work did your parents do?
Well, my father was a traveling salesman for a leather goods company, and he traveled around Germany to represent the company. And my mother worked my grandmother, her mother, had a dry goods store in Berlin, and so my mother worked at the dry goods store. And prior to going to the Philippines, she took lessons in millinery, making hats and things like that. So she had a talent for that.
And did you have any siblings, or?
I had a brother who died before I was ever born, so I never knew him, and so I'm an only child, in effect.
And when your parents decided to leave, was it because of Kristallnacht, or?
Yes, I think that was the impetus, because, I think the Jews in Germany were very much assimilated into society, German society, okay? And it was very hard for them to accept the fact that their friends, lifelong friends, were now turning on them and saying, we can't be seen with you anymore because we're afraid, etc. And I think Kristallnacht was the final straw that they said, it's not going to get any better.
Do you have any recollections of Kristallnacht?
No, I don't. I do not. I was, as I say, I think I was 4 years old at the time, so no, I do not. I never really thought of myself as a Holocaust survivor until one day I met somebody that was a hidden child, and they asked me, my story, and they said, of course you're a Holocaust survivor, and we have a group that meets, this was in New Jersey, every month, and so I got involved in, and then the German government recognized us and as also survivors, and I've twice now gotten some money from Germany to cover the lost opportunity of studying in Germany.
It's like reparations in a way.
Yeah, but it's not a monthly thing or an annual thing. It was just once I got it, was like 45 years or 50 years ago. I got a one-time thing, and within the past year I got a second payment of, again, a one-time payment for that. And each was 2,500 euros each payment, so it was not a lot of money, but it was recognition that we are survivors. And I sometimes, at this age, I've started to get interest in genealogy and trying to trace through my roots, but I just have not gotten started. Okay, I went to the cemetery in Berlin where my grandfather and my brother are buried, and I tried to see if I can get some information about the prior generations, and I really did not get any information such as where my grandfather was born or what in the records of the cemetery, They had his date of death, date of birth, but none of the history, like his father's name or his mother's name.
Did your parents ever speak about their families?
Not really. I knew that my dad had two sisters. One of them had immigrated to Brazil quite early on, who I never met or never met me. And the other one had a daughter. They both had daughters, and the other one stayed in Germany, had a daughter who was older than I am, and my dad, when we were in the Philippines, tried to get my cousin to come to the Philippines also, and at the last moment my cousin refused to come. She wanted to stay with her parents, and of course they didn't survive. So, and the aunt in Brazil, I met her daughter once, and my cousin once, who came here after the war to meet her uncle and meet me. But I tried to locate her. I went to Brazil some years ago, and I tried to locate her, and I was unable to. So, so that's some of my father's background. He had two sisters. My mother had a brother and a sister, and my uncle, her brother, studied medicine, and in the late 30s immigrated to Palestine and was here as a physician until he passed away a few years ago. And the other...
Did you get to meet him?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. After the war, when we were in the United States, Israel had some cruise ships, Zimline something, and he traded places with the ship's doctor for one trip to the United States, and so we got to meet him. And subsequent to that, one more time, when my wife and I came to Israel for a visit, we stayed with him for a couple of days and so forth. So, but it's not a very large family, and unfortunately, all that remains are my uncle's two daughters who were born in Israel, and they're the only first cousins that I have at this point. And one lives in Tel Aviv and one lives in Haifa.
So, George, can I just ask, when you left Berlin and your parents decided to go, was their first option to go to the Philippines, or it's a very unusual destination?
No, they originally were going to Montevideo, Uruguay, and then that got shut off from them. And
did they have visas to go?
They did, but the visas were canceled on them. And so the Philippines came up, and it was kind of a late thing in the Philippines, because the fact that the Philippines opened their door was largely the efforts of four American brothers who had a cigar factory in the Philippines. And they were from Cincinnati, and each brother took a rotating turn to be in the Philippines, and for I think a 2-year term or a 3-year term. Anyway, I think the Filipinos are very, class conscious, etc. So they became friendly with President Quezon from the Philippines, and it was in American territory, so there was a American High Commissioner by the name of McNutt, and they used to play poker together. And it was the brothers, and they were Frida, who convinced finally President Quezon to open up the borders for Jewish refugees. And they even went so far as put an ad in a newspaper in Berlin, which unfortunately I don't have a copy of it, but it may be in the museum here, saying that, inviting people to apply. By the time that 1941, when the Japanese invaded the Philippines, there were about 700 Jewish families that had taken advantage of that invitation and came to the Philippines.
And did your parents see the advert? Is that what?
Apparently they did. I never questioned it, and I got information because from when other people in Manila, other Jews were interviewed on the tape and in the escape to Manila, I got some more information from their point of view, and so they were able to fill in the gaps for me because they might have been a little bit older and a little more memory, you know.
And George, what do you remember about leaving Berlin? Do you have any recollections?
Yeah, I remember the train ride from Berlin to Italy because we had to go to Italy to catch the ship for the Philippines. So I remember that train ride because my birthday was on that train. And I remember the present I got was a model of an airplane with floats on it. I don't know why, but that sticks in my mind.
And who went with you in the family?
Initially, it was my mother, my father, and my father's mother, who was in her 80s. We traveled together. Following us was my mother's sister and brother-in-law and their 3 children. And I think that was, and my grandmother and grandfather. So I think there were 12 of us or 13 of us. At different times, not all at the same day, you know, just on the same ship. It was just my mother, my grandmother, and my dad, myself. And I remember it was an Italian ship.
Were you excited to go on this journey?
Yes, and the Italians, they called me Bambino, and they were trying to spoil me. They kept bringing me ice cream and so forth. So I remember that. Those are the good memories. Not the bad memories, you know. And also, when we got to the Philippines, I didn't speak any English. I only spoke German. And my mother thought she did the right thing and enrolled me in an American school that was there at the time. And I was miserable because I didn't understand the teacher, who was American, who spoke English, and the kids all spoke English, and I didn't understand what the teacher was saying. So the kids all were teasing me because I was a stranger. So I told my mother that I'm very unhappy in the school. So she took me out. She found that there was a Catholic convent, Santa Escolastica, whose nuns came from Germany. And a few of my compatriots, kids my age, didn't speak any English, they had enrolled into this Catholic school, exempting them from any religious instruction. Okay? So within a few months, I spoke English fluently. You know, I mean, that was it. You know, so life was, I would say, idyllic in the Philippines up until 1941, when the Japanese war started, December of.
And you were in Manila?
We're in Manila, yes.
And do you remember your accommodation where you stayed?
Yeah, we rented a house that was available, and life was, you know, nice.
Were you together with the other refugees?
Yes. We had one synagogue in Manila, and we had the Rabbi Schwartz, and he got a cantor Sisner. He talked him into coming from Germany into Manila. So we had our social life revolved itself around the synagogue. You know, they had a Hever Kadisha, and they had a men's club and a sisterhood, and you know, the typical, when we say typical, because it's not the Israeli way of doing it, but the American way of doing it, of having the social life within the synagogue type of things. No, and I was able to have lessons with the cantor for you know, Jewish history and religion and so forth.
And how old were you when you got to Manila?
I was 5 years old.
5 years old. And the boat trip, was it quite a long boat trip? If you
Yeah, but okay, well, it was long. It took about 3 weeks. But what happened was we had to go through the Suez Canal to get into the Pacific, from the Mediterranean into the Pacific. And when we were at the end of the Suez Canal, was a place called Aden. And we stopped in Aden, and that's when the war broke out. And that's when the captain, the ship was Italian, and Italy was had a pact with Hitler, that they mutual aid pact, etc. So now the captain had to make a decision: does he go back to Italy because Italy was now at war with Germany, or does he continue the voyage? And the impetus that gave him to try to continue was that we were surrounded by British warships in Aden, because again they didn't know what was going to happen or whatever, and so the captain ordered 100% blackout, and we snuck out. He snuck the ship out in the middle of the night and decided the best thing was to continue his journey to get as far away from Italy as he possibly could. This was to our benefit, obviously. So we did make it to the Philippines.
Were there many refugees on the ship?
I would think there were, I don't know, I mean, I would have to guess that there were maybe 20 or 30 on there.
And in Aden, did you disembark?
I don't remember that. I just remember having to get 100% blackout, and being told the reason was that they were trying to sneak out of the harbor before the enemy ships or the English ships were able to stop them, you know. So that's kind of, so as I say, you know, until the Japanese invaded the Philippines, it was kind of a nice life. They had their parties, they had their dances, they had American troops there, obviously, at that time, and it was an American protectorate. MacArthur was there, and Eisenhower was his aide at the time, so they were both in the Philippines.
Did you ever get to see them or meet them?
I did. I met General Eisenhower. I met after the war, when he made an inspection trip of the facilities in the Philippines, and I was kind of the mascot of the American military, because there were obviously very few white children, and I reminded them of their sons back home or their brothers back home or whatever. So that was probably the best years of my life, was you know, being involved with the U.S. Army at the time.
You have a picture, if you could.
Yeah, well, this was an Army chaplain.
This is an iconic picture.
Yes.
Here you together with, who's in the picture with you?
Okay. This is an Army chaplain. I don't know his name. And this was our cantor in the Philippines, sister.
And how old are you in this picture?
In this picture, I was 12 years old.
It's an incredible picture. So when the Philippines, when you first got there, life was it was okay?
Yes, it was fine.
And you had your grandmother, your grandfather,
and I had my 3 cousins, and my aunt, my uncle.
Did your father manage to find work, or?
He did. He bounced around. At one point, I remember he made pomade for the hair. Filipinos like to slick down their hair, so he was making pomade for them. But I just know that at the end of the war, he was representing a Swiss chemical company in Manila after the war, but I don't really know everything during the war.
And what is your memories when the Japanese invaded?
Okay, the same day, December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, they also bombed Manila. And so we knew that the invasion was coming. And my uncle, who was in the Philippines with us, worked for a Filipino company, National Coconut Company, and he lived in, I guess, a plantation where they had, and so he said, you know, why don't you all come over to us here in the, what do you call it, a forest or a plantation, rather than staying in the city of Manila, because the Japanese are going to come in, they're going to go into these big cities, and they may leave us alone. So we did. My dad, my mother, and I, and my grandmother came to the forest or the plantation, and eventually a Japanese patrol did come by and found us. And my recollection is that they lined us up against the wall, because they didn't speak any English or German, and they didn't understand what we were saying, but they didn't know if we were Americans or if we were Australians, or okay, in other words, were we friend or were we foe? And Hitler, in his egotistical way, the passports that we had from Germany, the cover had a big swastika on it. The inside had a big J in it. The Japanese didn't know what the J was, but they saw the swastika. They said, ah, German, you're friends, you're allies. Okay? So we didn't want to bust their bubble. So we said, yeah, we're Germans. Okay? The passport may have said we're stateless inside, but outside he had to have a swastika on there, so that saved us. So the patrol led us to the center of town, which I remember was an officer sitting with his feet in a tub of water because it was very hot out, and fanning himself, and he spoke English, and he gave us a safe conduct pass to go back to Manila, so that if any of the Japanese troops stopped us on the way, we would have a pass to show we could. And so we eventually went back to Manila, where we had left all our things in our house. Okay? So my first recollection of the Japanese is standing there with bayonets at us, and you know, the Japanese are not very quiet people. They yell, they shout, and they may say the nicest things, but they're shouting it, and you don't know what they're saying because they're Japanese. So it's very scary. Okay? But that was my introduction to the Japanese.
And then did things deteriorate? Did things get much worse?
They did. Well, once the Japanese established their government there, for example, whenever they had a facility that was guarded by a Japanese soldier, and you walked by, you had to stop and bow to this Japanese soldier. I mean, the Japanese are very big on bowing, so you had to bow to the sentry, and if you didn't bow, then the sentry would either slap you or kick you or whatever, cause bodily harm to you. So you learn that when you walk by a sentry, you know, you have to bow. It was kind of a, how can I say, kind of a, they left our synagogue alone for the most part, and our rabbi tried to negotiate with the Japanese authorities to leave us be, and then in I guess it was 1944, Berlin sent a letter to the German consulate in the Philippines with the names of all of the Jews that immigrated to the Philippines, and told the Japanese to incarcerate them. And the Japanese were too busy losing the war, and they didn't really care. So, you know, I have a copy of the letter in Yad Vashem that was sent, and our names were on that letter. So, but the Japanese didn't. It wasn't until the Americans started to make advances and the Japanese realized that they were losing the war. Their supply lines had been cut initially. The supply lines were by sea, and I think, you know, there was a big battle, Midway battle, that the Americans won, and they cut the supply lines. So now the Japanese had to live off the land. So now they confiscated all the food they could get a hold of, and they left very little for the population. You know, they would take the chickens and for their own food, and they ate rice, best quality of rice for themselves and so forth. So food started to become very scarce, and you learn to eat things I wouldn't eat now, okay, which, you know, would make me feel sick just to think of it. But the versatility, I mean, I never knew rice could be so versatile, but you'd ground it into flour and you make rice bread out of rice flour. You'd roast rice and make coffee out of roasted rice. Okay. You'd make tea out of any leaves that you could get out of the trees, you know. And sugar, you'd have to use molasses, which is a product of refining the sugar. And they took the refined sugar and they left us the molasses as sweeteners. So food started to become scarce, and that became a problem. But once the Americans started to close in on the Philippines and landed in Leyte, the Japanese decided that they were going to disseminate, they were going to emasculate all of Manila. So when the American troops entered Manila, they would find nothing. And so they started on a 3-week killing anybody that they found, burning down all the houses they could get to. And that was really the worst part of the whole war, was those 3 particular weeks. Okay? My mother had a brother in the Philippines and his wife, and they took shelter in a Red Cross building, thinking that the Japanese would honor the Red Cross. Instead, there were 100 people in that Red Cross building. Only 2 of them survived, and it wasn't my uncle and my aunt. And the 2 survivors wrote what happened there. The Japanese came in and bayoneted and shot everybody in there. And in our particular case, we were in our house and realized or heard the Japanese enter the house next door, and where we knew the neighbors, and so we were watching through the window, and they entered that house, and I know they had a little baby, and they threw the baby up and caught it on the end of their bayonet as it was coming down, and then they set fire to the house.
And did you see this? Did
yes,
you witness this?
Yes. And at that point, we said, you know, we need to go out the back way, because the Japanese were in front of the house, go out the back way. And there was a house in back of us that had burned the day before, and the roofs of these houses were corrugated metal. So the corrugated roof metals did not burn, you know, just the wood structure burned. So we snuck underneath and covered ourselves with I guess the tin roofs, that corrugated tin roofs that we had. And just my luck, somebody who had already been bayoneted was lying next to me, and so for 2 days we had to lie there quietly, hoping the Japanese would not lift up the roof things. And finally we heard somebody say, oh, the Americans are only a mile away south from here. And so my dad said, okay, let's try to get to the American lines. Right? And so we made our way south to about the 1 mile to get to the American lines. And all the while that there was shooting going on to the street that we were on. So, you know, we had to go from building to building or whatever, you know, to shelter to escape the bullets. And we did make it to the American lines, and it was our first interaction with American troops.
Can I ask, when you were hiding, the person who was bayoneted, was
Yes.
he still alive?
No, it was a baby.
And you actually saw, you witnessed?
Yeah.
It must have been horrific for you.
It was. It was. I mean, those are the kind of things you really would rather forget than to relive again, you know. But there were facts.
So, George, can I just ask, how come it's not such public knowledge? It's cruelty, it's terrible atrocities.
Well, the knowledge...
You have a book that you have here from Escape to Manila, from Nazi tyranny to Japanese terror.
Yeah, the rampage of those 3 weeks is James Scott caught them in his book.
You can see the destruction of Manila
Yes.
in these pictures. And did you witness the buildings in Manila being destroyed?
Yeah, well, I obviously the houses, you know, our street, they were indiscriminately attacked, blown up. And the Japanese, had said that they, I mean, we knew some Japanese because they had confiscated the house across from us for their officers earlier on in the occupation. And they came to us when they were leaving and they said, you know, we're never going to get back to Japan. We're not going to live through this. We're here to delay the advance of the Americans. Yeah.
And a lot of, I think, Americans or people on the island were put into camps, the Japanese put them in camps?
Yes, they were. Americans and any of the Allied countries.
So here we have in the book a picture of some of the prisoners, or civilians, that they were nearly on the verge of starvation.
Yes.
So how come the story of what happened in the Philippines isn't so widely known?
I think it's a question of numbers, because we were only, what, maybe 1,400, 700 families, 1,400 individuals, or maybe 1,500 individuals, and certainly we were a small number compared to the Holocaust that occurred in Europe with the various camps and so forth, and the crematories, and so therefore we're really just a very small part. And it's interesting that the Filipinos did not learn that part of their history. And as I say, when we made this video, and it was shown throughout the United States and Israel on public television, we then took it to the Philippines, back to the Philippines, and we showed it to the president, the then president of the Philippines, and so he invited us to the palace, and he had his senators and come down and witness this. And there's a Jewish congregation in Manila, and so obviously when I went back with some of the other people that are on this thing, I stayed with the Jewish community because I think I was the only Orthodox person there. And they, by the way, in the synagogue, or outside the whole synagogue, they have this picture. And
the picture of you with the...
Yes. And they, you know, when I came, they introduced me. They said, well, you've seen his likeness so many years, now you're going to see him in flesh. And so they had a special Shabbat dinner where I could tell my story. And they invited the educational people from Manila to this Shabbat dinner. And after the dinner, I spoke to the Commissioner of Education, and he said, oh, we're now going to put that into the curriculum to teach.
It wasn't before?
And apparently it was not before. I said, you know.
So, George, I just want to show, here's a picture of MacArthur returning to the ruins of his home, once on top of the luxurious Manila Hotel in February 1945. And American tank rumbles through the historic gate for the Fort Santiago inside the walled city in February 26, 45. So you can see there was really a lot of destruction. Why did the Japanese want to destroy the city?
They didn't want the Americans to find anything there. You know.
Do you know roughly how many people were killed during these 3 weeks?
Yeah, it's in the thousands. It's
You and your family must be petrified.
Yeah, well, as I said, the uncle and aunt that I had were killed in the Red Cross building. And incidentally, when he mentions the survivors from the Red Cross building, their story, and I wrote to him and I said that my uncle and aunt were part of the 98 people that were killed there, and so he thanked me for that. And another bit of trivia, well, a couple of things of trivia, but when we reached the American line, we took shelter at a house that was still standing there, and you know, the troops were marching by, so we knew that the Japanese weren't going to be there. So another family whose daughter was my age also made it to that same place, and the husband or the father of this young girl said, you know, I have to go back and get a suitcase from our house, so you stay here, you're safe here, and I'll be back. Okay. Well, so he left, and when he didn't come back, my father and my uncle decided to go back themselves to see what happened to him, and they found that the Japanese had caught up with that gentleman and had killed him. And my dad had to come back and give that sad news to the wife and daughter that their father and their husband has been killed. Had he not gone back, he would have remained alive. And the second bit of trivia is watching the soldiers, the American Army, you know, marching, and it happened to have been the 11th Airborne Division, which is, you know, our hero. All of a sudden, my grandfather and I said to me, you know, let's go greet the American Army. And we walked to the corner, and a shell exploded right as we walked to the corner, and my grandfather was killed by that shell, and he was next to me, and I survived. So when you ever want to get the question is, you know, how come I survived and my grandfather was killed instantly, you don't get an answer to that. Okay, I can probably justify having a, you know, family from a single child, having what, 14 grandchildren, and God knows 30 some odd great grandchildren, all from one person. And you know, if I had not survived, they wouldn't be here.
And you actually saw your grandfather be...
He was right next to me. It was a shell that exploded.
Were you injured, or...?
No, I was not. That was a miracle.
An incredible miracle.
So, anyway, and so I asked myself why, and I'm trying, looking at my big family now and saying, I guess that's why, but
it's really a miracle. It's a miracle that you weren't injured either.
Right, it was. I can only say Hashem has been good to me.
And George, can I ask? Absolutely, it was a nice, it was a real miracle that you survived, and
yes.
But the trauma of seeing your
yes,
your grandfather being killed. How old you were? 5, 6?
No, I was 12.
Were you 12 at this time?
1945.
Oh, this is in 45. Of course, in 45.
1945. Yeah, I was 12, and after the war, my parents wanted very much to get to America. They wanted me to be bar mitzvahed in America rather than the Philippines. And the German quota, the United States at that point had a quota. So many people from each country were allowed in. And because during the war, the German quota was not filled because people weren't immigrating to Germany. So it became cumulative. So it was very easy to get visas to the United States under the German quota. And Germany, and the United States didn't recognize us as stateless. As far as they were concerned, we were Germans, or German citizens.
Now, what I meant, you were 5, 6 when you actually arrived in Manila.
Right.
And you were there during the duration of the war.
Right.
And this picture, if you can just show this picture again, here you were 12 years old.
Yes.
So, this is an absolute iconic picture, George. It's incredible. And when you were standing next to your grandfather, you were only 12.
Yes.
So it still you must those images.
Well, it's ingrained in me. We immediately, as my grandfather got hit by shrapnels, and as he got hit, he turned around to me and said, "You better go back, it's getting dangerous," and he fell. So he had presence of mind to send me back before he died. And of course we immediately got an army medic who was with the troops, to come over and see if he could save him. And he said, it's too late, nothing can be done. So obviously they had to bury him right then and there. And after the hostilities ended, etc., they were able to exhume the body and bring him to the Jewish cemetery in Manila. There is a, I don't want to say a monument, but there is a stone in the Jewish cemetery with the names of all of the Jewish refugees who were killed during that 3-week period. So it was not just my grandfather, my uncle, my aunt, but other were killed too, and who were not with us at the time, but were on their own, and only found out later on that they didn't make it. So.
George, when you told your parents what had happened, it must have been, as a 12-year-old, it must have been so difficult for you. So
it was, because obviously my mother was very emotional, and which I don't blame her, but you become hardened. We went through the war. You sort of become hardened at the time, and you don't necessarily think logically. I mean, you're used to hiding behind things to ward off getting shot and so forth. So, you're like the soldiers, psychologically, because you know, you've got soldiers who are hardened by the fact that they've seen deaths and killed and so forth. So on that basis, we have. I guess I was hardened at that time.
And this was the grandfather who took you to shore?
Yes.
And you were very close with him?
Yes.
What was his name?
Arthur Asher.
May his memory be for eternal blessing. Oh, this is unbelievable. Wow. And can I just ask, what is your recollections of when you met the Americans? And
number one, it was joy, but number two, you know, you're looking for Jewish soldiers.
And were they very kind to you, the Americans? Were they?
Very much so. Very much so.
You can see in the picture, you were their mascot.
Yes.
Were there any other children your age that...
Yeah, but we didn't all live in the same in the same street or the same area, and different troops involved, etc. First of all, once things settled down a little bit, they supplied us, the American Army supplied us with medicine and food and what have you. You know, I got to know a sergeant who was a sergeant in the commissary, and he would bring over stuff to us, etc. So, you know, we did very well. I had a pass to get on the Army base, and I was spoiled. One of them had written his sister to send me a care package, so from Michigan. So I got a care package with toys and candy in it from his sister. Another one was, it's funny, the fellow that was a supply sergeant who supplied us with stuff, he came from Illinois, from Chicago, and once we were in America, my wife and I had some relatives that lived in Chicago, and so we took a car trip to Chicago, and I mentioned to this relative in his house about the soldier, and I said his name was, I remembered his name, Leonard Kane was his name. So this relative said, well, we have a Leonard Kane in our congregation, I wonder. So we picked up the phone, and it was the same Leonard Kane.
Wow.
As a civilian. So he came over, so we reminisced a little bit. Another one had, my grandmother had some relatives here in America whose son, I guess, was not part of the initial troops in the Philippines, but got assigned to the Philippines once things had quieted down, etc. So his parents told him, when you're in the Philippines, look up and see if you can find a family called Loewenstein. So he did. So obviously there was a connection there. So yeah, I mean, under the Americans, had a great time. They introduced me to Cherry Coke at the PX and yeah, all sorts of things.
And were there quite a few Jewish soldiers in the American forces?
Yes. Yeah. As a matter of fact, they all came to this Passover Seder. I mean, this wasn't just our civilian Seder, but it was a military Seder. So they had sent a notice to all the troops in the Philippines that any Jewish troops that want to attend the Seder, you know, to make arrangements to come to Manila to be at the Seder. So
if you could show this iconic picture. So this was at the, was the Seder?
And this was a Seder, yes.
And you did the Manishtana?
Yes.
And you remember that evening? You remember the Seder?
I remember that evening well.
Were there many, was it full? Were there many soldiers in attendance?
Soldiers, sailors, airmen.
And a lot of the Jewish community?
And the Jewish community, yes. There are a lot of the refugees. But we were outnumbered by the military.
It must have been a very joyous occasion.
It was a racetrack, held an open-air racetrack, and it was just filled with military uniform. And I guess in a lot of ways it brought sentimental tears to their eyes, because they remembered Seder's at home, and them either saying the 4 questions, or they had children that would say it at home, etc. So it was a little bit of home. You know, one of them who was in the Navy was stationed in Manila for a while, and he was Orthodox, and he led services for us every Friday night in my grandmother's house. He'd come and he'd, you know, lead the services for us. So there's a lot of interaction with the American troops, obviously.
And when they came, so having had to eat meager portions and eating rice, all of a sudden
you got sick. I got sick.
Because the food was very rich, I think, what they gave you. Did they give you candy? And
yes. Speaking of candy, there was one occasion, it's on a tape, where at the time that the Americans were bombing Manila, you know, but they were very selective in where they bombed. They only bombed military sites. They didn't bomb civilian sites. Okay? So they pretty well had disseminated the anti-aircraft, so they had real disguise. So when we heard planes coming over, we would go out on the street and watch the planes, because we had no fear that they would machine gun us or anything, because they were very precise. Okay? So we saw this one plane coming down very low, and we saw him, and then he did a 180, and he came back, and as he came by us, he dropped out of there a candy bar, a Hershey bar, and we split that among all the kids that were there. We hadn't eaten chocolate in years, you know, so that was a highlight. I don't know who the pilot was, never met him, but you know, it's don't forget, you know, they all have kids. They love their kids and their brothers and so forth, and so they saw white kids, and right away there was an affinity there. You know, who are you? Anyway.
And when did you go to America? When did you get the visas?
We got to America. It's another funny story. In October of 1946. And
so it was a year, basically nearly a year, well, half a year, it was a year after
they had to investigate us, and they investigated my father to see whether he had collaborated with the Japanese in any way, and medically he had to examine and so forth. So that all took time. Okay, the military was investigating us, and but obviously when we came to America, we came by boat, and we were in the Pacific, and relatives we had were here in New York, so we had to go cross town by train. And I had always been told by Americans and so forth that America is a rich country, and you'll find gold on the street and so forth. And when we arrived at Grand Central Station in New York, they had all these kids saying, you know, with their hand out, dressed in rags and so forth, and have their hands out. And I said, hey, something's wrong here. I said, we were told, you know, that America is such a rich country. How come all these kids are begging? So they had explained to me that this was Halloween night that we arrived, and that this was a custom at Halloween for them to go around begging for candy. And so, and I said, you know, I didn't know that. So I got indoctrinated into the American way very quickly. But it left a bad taste in my mouth. And when my kids got to the age, I said, listen, you want to go to a Halloween party, ducking apples? I said, that's fine, but I don't want you to bother the neighbors, and I don't want you to go around ringing their doorbells and so forth. So to this day, they resent that. They bring that up to me. You wouldn't let us do this.
And when you came to America, did Did you go with your family as well? Your grandmother?
Yeah,
joined you?
yes, except for the three that got killed, yes.
And did you, when you got to America, did you have a easy integration? Or
Well, first of all, we spoke the language, so there was no problem communicating. Number two, again, there was Jewish organizations that, how can I say, that opened doors for us. You know, they got us the first rental where we stayed and so forth. And my mother got a job, and at that she worked as a salesperson in a 5 and 10 cent store, and finally transferred over to Macy's and lifelong employee at Macy's. And my dad got a job in a German Jewish firm, and he was their bookkeeper, and he was with them till his death. He died very early. He was 59 years old when he died.
and did you go to public school or?
Yeah, I went to public school.
In New York?
In New York, yes.
And how was the interaction with the other children?
Well, initially, I had reactions. Okay, the first time I heard a plane overhead, I jumped underneath the desk, and the kids sort of laughed at me, and the teacher had to explain to them that what I went through, and you know, the air raid siren would go off or whatever, and you'd try to get shelter someplace. Okay, that was it. And also, the first time it snowed, you know, kids, I saw snow, and whereas the teacher made all the kids sit down at their desk, and she allowed me to look out the window for a few minutes to see the snow, because it was a new experience for me. So. But other than that, I think that a lot of the kids were Jewish in school. I remember my junior high, we sort of had a clique. There were all Jews in the clique.
Did they ask you about your wartime experiences?
Yeah, one of the kids in my class came from Shanghai, so he had gone through it in Shanghai, China. And the others, one was had hidden in France. So they all had that kind of experience. Okay. So.
And your bar mitzvah?
Bar mitzvah was, I mean, it was low-keyed because obviously there was no money available to have a big party, etc. But I remember my grandmother bought me a radio that I really wanted, and so, you know, my parents tried to make the best of it. But, I remember my bar mitzvah.
And George, can I ask, being in America in school, you were happy when you came to America? It was a good life?
I think so. I mean, it was a hard life. At first we were poor, but it was certainly much better than what we had. And I made friends and tried to live a typical teenage life, you know, teenager life. But there was something lacking in the fact that I didn't grow up as a child. I grew up as a mature person because during the war,
like you witnessed,
you know, and I regret, but I never really learned how to play with my children. I never could get on the floor and build blocks with them or something like that. I didn't know how to interact with them because I've always interacted with adults during the war. You know?
And being maybe an only child as well.
And being an only child, yes. So those are some of the things that, you know, my background has affected my my thinking or my ability.
And George, can I ask, your parents, when they came to America, did they become a bit more religious, a bit more orthodox?
No, that didn't change until I moved to New Jersey, and there was only one synagogue in the community that I moved into. I mean, in New Jersey, they had a lot of small communities, and each seemed to have their own synagogue. And so the synagogue that was in my community was a conservative synagogue. So, because I had to send my kids to Hebrew school, and so we went to services every Friday night and Saturday morning, and it's the fact that we were living 2 blocks away from the synagogue, I wouldn't ride on the Shabbos. So that sort of was a middle of the roadway, and it wasn't until I retired, and at that time the congregation became egalitarian, and I just didn't have taste for women being called up for aliyahs.
It's something it was a bit foreign.
Yeah, it was foreign to me, and I couldn't live with it. Okay? So then I wound up going into the Orthodox.
And what type of work did you do after?
I'm a CPA.
And you studied at
City College in New York.
And your parents, were a lot of their friends, were they also survivors?
Yes,
or?
yes. They were either survivors, or they were friends from Germany that had immigrated, before the war started, that had gotten visas for whatever reason. Yeah, so it was, you gravitate to your own, So it wasn't until, I guess I got married and became a father that my social life was more among Americans than it was among refugees. Because in college I joined a fraternity, and so all of those were Americans, and so the division became less and less between a refugee and a citizen, and I was lucky I don't have an accent. At least I thought I didn't, until I got to college and I had to take a speech course, and my instructor picked me up and said, "Oh, you're from German. And, how do you know? What's the way you pronounce your R's?" Okay, so he picked up on it, but nobody else ever did.
And when you got to America, that's when you changed your name from Hans to
when I became
George.
a citizen, yeah.
When you became a citizen?
Yes, because I didn't want to be called German,
But you still kept Hans as a second name?
Yeah, but I don't use it unless I officially have to. No, I did it because I wanted to. I didn't want to dishonor my parents. They thought that Hans was a good name at the time. It was Germany, and George was after my grandfather, who had predeceased my being born. So I didn't want to dishonor them. So I said, let me just switch and keep the names, but in a different order.
So if you could show a picture of your father.
Yes, this is my dad.
This is amazing. Your father had the insight to leave Germany, where many others thought it would blow over.
Yes, exactly.
It wasn't a simple thing what he did.
No.
And you have a very special, and you have a picture of your mother.
Yes, part of my family.
So your mother is on the left side.
Yeah. Her mother's here, yeah.
So here are the two grandmothers with
yes, and some of the grandchildren.
And your mother's on the left.
Yes.
And that's your wife's mother, your mother-in-law.
Yes.
On the right. And George, you also showed in they have here in Israel a very special monument in Rishon LeZion.
Yes.
So if you could just discuss a little bit, if you could tell us a little bit about this very special monument.
Okay. Where you had mentioned very little knowledge of the Philippines, having saved Jews. In Israel, apparently there is knowledge of it, and they wanted to honor the Philippines for what they did, and so they decided that between them and the Philippine government to build a monument to honor them. And the monument depicts 3 open doors to show it's an open door policy. And they wanted to have footprints in front of each of these 3 doors to enhance the tale of the monument, or the description of the monument. So they picked myself as one set of another survivor who I was living in the United States at the time, lived in Israel, and a third was a young child who was born from a survivor. So those are the 3 of us in each of the doors, each one of us. And there's a inscription there with our names on it, etc., and a little bit about our story on this monument.
And there's a joint stamp from...
And these are stamps, and if you look at the back of it, you can quickly see it's a joint issue.
And there's also a monument, this is very beautiful, there's also a monument in Boys Town.
Yes, they called me, and when they put that monument up, they called me, and I went there, and I met the people in Boys Town, and I saw the monument.
And today in Boys Town there's also the Wilson Yeshiva, side by side, and it's doing very well.
Yeah, and when I made Aliyah, which is, I guess, about almost 2 years ago, I did notify the Philippine consul, that I'm here, that if they had any events or something, that I would be very glad to come. So the next thing I got was a phone call from the cultural attaché for the Philippines, inviting me to the embassy for the Christmas tree lighting, which will be held on a Friday night. So I said, well, I appreciate the invitation. I said, but number one, Friday, start of Shabbos. I said, I can't possibly get to the embassy, which is in Tel Aviv, and back to Jerusalem before Shabbos starts. And I said, I don't really think it's quite appropriate for me to wind up lighting the Christmas tree for you. I said, but if you have any other events, such as, I don't know, do you celebrate Independence Day or whatever, I would be very glad to, be with you. So I didn't hear back.
Well, please God. And George, can I just ask, when you went back to the Philippines?
Yes, I did.
It must have been very emotional going back.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. Excuse me for 1 minute.
So, George, if you could just tell us a little bit about your trip when you decided to go back to the Philippines.
Well, actually, the trip was based on this particular DVD. And
it's called Rescue in the Philippines,
right.
Refugee from the Holocaust.
Right.
And you were interviewed in this video.
Yeah, yes, I was, and we wanted to present a copy of that DVD to the Philippine government, the current Philippine government, and I had mentioned that the Frida brothers, who initiated this whole thing because they had a factory, a cigar factory in the Philippines, their children and grandchildren wanted to go back and see what the factory was and see how that history developed itself. And so therefore we decided to go back for a week in order to have them review where the factory was and so forth. And so part of that week we spent with the president, the president of the Philippines and his Senate, and we showed that video to them. And I sort of absented myself from a lot of the things that the group was doing, because I wanted to spend more time with the Orthodox community. I wanted to go to the cemetery, for example, to visit the graves and so forth. So
that's where your grandfather is.
Yes. So I had sort of had my own agenda. I wanted to go back and see, you know, the street where I lived on and so forth. So,
and it's still there? It still exists?
well, they changed the names, but yeah, we worked it out. So I had different objectives. I just took advantage of their trip to do that.
And was it very well publicized? You coming with the...
No, I think the Jewish community knew that because I wrote to them, and because number one, I didn't stay at the same hotel that they did, because I wanted a hotel that was as close to the synagogue as possible, because I was going to be there for Shabbos. Mm-hmm. They did things on Shabbos that I wouldn't join them. Okay, I would spend Shabbos with. So I got to meet the president and the director, and met a lot of the Filipinos that converted to Judaism. You know, there was Sephardic, and I davened Ashkenazic, but anyway, I was able to muddle my way through their tefillas, and you know, I spoke to the rabbi, and you know.
And you were well accepted by the president?
We were well received, yes. I mean, you know, he had kind of a luncheon in our honor. After we showed the DVD, he had luncheon served in the palace. And
was the press present?
Yes, yes.
So it was a big event. It was
yes. Well, I mean, I don't know in his mind whether it was a big event or not. I mean, we.
But you're very grateful that you went. It was.
Yeah. I mean, it gave me a chance to go back, and I sort of feel a debt and an obligation morally to the Philippines, because I assume that if they hadn't let us in, we would not be alive today. Okay, so my wife has a Filipina aid, and in a way I feel I'm paying back to them. You know, anytime I can help her aid out, I do. Just in gratitude for her. But she doesn't know any of the story except when I first told it to her. But she's in her 40s, and she said, we didn't learn about this in school. I said, did you learn about the Japanese occupation? I mean, it was part of your history, right? So she said, well, yeah, we learned that there was a war and that the Japanese invaded the Philippines, but certainly not any details. So, well, we were kind of a small peg in a large hole. I mean, we were very few people compared to total civilization. So, but the Jewish community in the Manila now, I mean, they had this picture on the wall, so they knew about the fact that, and the honest truth is that none of these survivors from the Philippines made it their life in the Philippines. They immigrated to the U.S., some to Australia, but they all seem to have left the Philippines.
It's true, you know, in this book, A Mirror in Manila,
yeah,
where you had from the Mir Yeshiva, you had three Bochrim,
right,
the Nussbaums and Soroka. As soon as they could leave, they actually left.
Yes. Well, I mean, I don't know the thinking, except, you know, my dad wanted me bar mitzvah in America. I don't know, that was a dream of his, okay? So, but I don't know the motivations why, you know, everybody else left after the war, but I think maybe it was just to cut some of the memories and say, you know, well, we don't want to live with this by physically seeing it every day if we live here, right? But as I say, I wanted to, I mean, I went back to Germany also to visit graves, also to get my birth certificate, which I needed here to make Aliyah to Israel, and I wondered. I was brought up most of my life early in my life was as a German. We spoke German at home. My parents, as friends, were all German, Jewish, or Germans. I wanted to know if I was German. It's an odd thing, isn't it, to have that question in your mind. I mean, I was born there. I speak the language. Am I that person? And I found out that I have nothing in common with the Germans when I went there. You know, I thought they were arrogant in a lot of cases, and you know, it's.
Was it a difficult journey to go back? Very emotional.
Well, not so much, because I didn't have those memories. Okay, I was looking for identity. Okay, was I American? Was I German? My whole family was German. You know, as far back as I could see. You know, so do I have German mannerisms? I guess is more what I was trying to find out.
Did you feel any connection?
No,
not at all.
No. I don't feel that I don't have an arrogant attitude about me. I try to help people where I can, and I walked by people, obviously American tourists, who were trying to get directions from a German who I knew would be able to at least understand English, but he made out like he couldn't understand them. So I intervened and I translated for them. I'm trying to, in my mind, say that, look, I can't fault people that weren't even born at the time of the Holocaust. I can't have guilt by association. I can't believe in that, okay? I'm not responsible for what my parents did. And I don't think any young German should be responsible for what their parents did, except if their ideology is still very far to the right or something. But other than that, no. I met this one couple, German couple in Hamburg, who went, after hearing the story, went to their parents and said, "How come you never told us about this? We didn't hear anything." This was, before it became very public, so I can't fault young. So I think last year on Holocaust, during Holocaust Remember, I was asked to give a talk to a group that was between 18 and 19 in their gap year. Okay, they were either going into the army or and I gave a talk, and people question and answers, and one fellow said, how do you feel about the Germans now? And I said, well, I don't feel part of them. I'm not them. And I said, and I really think they're a bunch of cowards. Okay. So after I got through with the talk, he came up to me and said, I'm German. And I said, well, I'm sorry if I insulted you, but I didn't start it. You're maybe not your generation, but the prior generation started it. I mean, we were very happy being integrated into German society before Hitler came to power.
It's so hard to believe that the most cultured in music, in philosophy, it was the center of Europe. It could have done the worst possible imaginable horrific atrocities. But when you went to the cemetery, did you feel some type of connection, some type of...
Yeah, I did, because I know the people that were buried in the cemetery. My grandfather and my grandmother of mine are buried in that cemetery, and so of course I felt them.
But walking in the streets, you didn't feel any connection, or...
Yeah, but I recalled, thank God, the good times, not the bad times. Right? I kid my Filipino worker because, number one, I used to speak Tagalog fluently. Now I don't, because I haven't used it in 50 years or 60 years. But certain products like ice cream, Magnolia was the ice cream company there, and I remember Magnolia or San Miguel beer or things like that, or the fruits that I remember. I tease her about that, or Filipino food dishes. So in that way, I've tried to recall the good things, the good memories. And it's very hard to live dwelling on negatives, even though the son that you met keeps accusing me of being negative. And so I'm the product of my environment, of my experiences, but I don't think of myself negative. These are the facts.
Not at all. I think it's amazing, man. George, if I could ask, and I'm sure your kids and grandkids ask you, what message could you impart to the next generations? I mean, you've seen so much personally. You've gone through so much.
Well,
and you've seen so many miracles.
Well, the thing I impart to the next generation is you've got to take the anti-Semitism seriously, because I think it's the start of something that, if it's not stopped, it's going to mushroom. And there really is no saying as to how far that can go unless it's stopped. And it's very important that you become cognizant of it. I think that the family that I have here is Haredi.
It's very Orthodox.
Very Orthodox. And I think that the fact that they isolate themselves with their own kind, they're really not doing anything against anti-Semitism. They're not fighting anti-Semitism because they're living in their own little cocoon, so to speak. Okay? They're not out in the world. And the only thing that they care about is to maintain the status quo within their group. And I think there's a danger there in that, potentially. But that's my own feeling. And obviously they don't agree with me.
But coming to Israel, was it always a dream of yours, or?
What's that?
Coming to live in Israel?
No, it wasn't always a dream of mine. Number one, I guess what motivated me to do it now is that I've got a lot of my relatives here. And when I retired to Florida, and I spent 20 years in Florida. I had no relatives in Florida. And as our health started to deteriorate, I said, we really have no help here, moral or physical. And so I said, so let's see if we can immigrate, because here I've got 9 grandchildren, 8 of them are married with children. So I've got 34 great-grandchildren here, and my son and daughter-in-law. You met my son. My son lives 2 blocks away from here, so he's available if I need something. I just have to call him, and he's down here in 10 minutes, So it was more that rather than the country per se.
But you're happy you came?
No, I'm not integrated into Israeli society yet.
It will take time, but...
It is so different than what I'm used to. And I don't know if I'll ever be fully integrated, but it is what it is.
Well, I just want to thank you.
You're very welcome.
It's been such an honor and a privilege to be with you. And George, I don't know, I must just tell you, you epitomize the wandering Jew. You having been born in Germany, having to be displaced to the Philippines, then going to America and coming here now. But if we look at this picture, and I cannot tell you how I am just, when we look at this picture, it is iconic. This is the most amazing picture. It's just amazing. You were really part of history, and you saw it, and you witnessed miracles, and I'm just so grateful for this opportunity to hear it from you.
I appreciate your taking the time out to listen to me, and I'm willing to talk about it because I think it needs to be publicized.
I couldn't agree more.
And whatever opportunity presents itself for me to talk about it, I do.
Well, I want to thank you, and you should just have Mazla and Bracha.
Thank you.
And enjoy your time here. It's a very special place, being in Yerushalayim, but most important with your family.
Yes.
And we're very honored to have you. And at May Vestrim in good health.
Thank you very, very much.
George, really, thank you so much. Really, it really has been the biggest honor and a privilege.
Okay.